This week's tip of the week is about marking swatches prior to doing the gauge calculation. And gauge calculation actually involves a couple of steps, the way we do it in the master's program and in the basics course, which we have found to be the most accurate, by the way, which is why we do it that way. The first is to knit the swatch, and you don't want to knit just 5 or 6 stitches. You want to knit an actual swatch that's going to give you a representation of what this pattern or whatever is in the garment you're doing. Block it. That's important. Block it the way that it's going to look in the project. It's particularly important for lace. It's going to be a moving target unless you do that. And then you mark it, and that's what we're going to talk about in this tip. And then the next step is to count the number of rows and stitches. That will be next week. And then measure the swatch. We'll do that next week as well. And then do the actual gauge calculations. And I've worked up a variety of swatches which I have marked. Now when you mark a swatch, you never, ever, ever want to include something that is not part of the stitch pattern. Selvage stitches are not the same size as either stitches or rows, so you want to exclude them. And in this case, in garter stitch, I need to know where one stitch ends and the next stitch begins. Now how I look at it is a garter stitch is comprised of a frown and 2 smileys. The smiles are between the stitches. That's the beginning of the stitch, that's the beginning of the next stitch. The frown at the top, that is the stitch. So when I mark for garter stitch, I want to make sure that I mark a column of frowns so that I know I am between 2 stitches. Now also notice on this one, where I am placing my markers is at the middle, here and here, because that's where I'm going to get the best representation of what the gauge is. It's not going to be influenced by the cast on or bind off edges. And this is particularly true for cable or lace patterns. Now, I've marked over here in the frown between the 2 stitches, and here are my rows. Now this row down here is kind of uneven and bumpy due to the ribbing, so I'm going to place my marker above this row. That means when I do my measuring, I'm going to measure from here up to here. These are the rows that I'm actually going to be measuring. And I've marked it in the center, so when I do my measurements, we'll see I'm going to be measuring from here to here for my stitches and from here to here for my row. Now let's look at how I've done this for stockinette. Also, it's important when you're placing your markers, make sure that you have your cast on edge at the top, or your cast on edge at the bottom and your bind off edge at the top. That's going to enable you to have your stitches oriented in the proper way. Now again, I do not want to include my selvage stitches, and I've blocked this so that my selvage stitches are fairly flat. They're easy to see. And a stitch in stockinette is a V. Between a stitch is an upside down V. So this spot is between stitches, and this is, you see, that's between stitches, this is the stitch. If you're doing this for the master's program, make sure that you place your markers between stitches. It might be that you are able to identify a half of a stitch for your stitch count so that your calculation is correct, but it just makes it a little easier for the reviewer to check your work if you're placing your markers in between stitches. Now, for this particular example, I'm going to be measuring. I've placed my marker in the first row of stitches, and that row of stitches is actually part of my cast on edge. The stitches are a little smaller, and I'm going to be measuring from the bottom of this stitch up to the top. And where I have marked this is right below the bind off edge, and I'm not going to include that or this or the bind off in my row calculations. If you look at the cast on edge or at the bind off edge, they are not a row. They are not the same size of a row, and so you should never include those in your calculations. So here is my stockinette stitch. I've marked it in the center, it's been blocked, and now I'll be able to do my calculation. Now here I've got some seed stitch, and I'm going to make sure that I've got the bind off edge at the top, which I do. And this actually hasn't been blocked all that well. Don't do this at home. It was the only example I could find. Siege stitch stitches are easy to see. The selvage is very easily identified, so I can put my markers there. Rows are a bit harder. Now when I am marking siege stitch rows, because they're kind of hard to count, and we'll go into that next week, I place it at the bottom. Where I'm going to start measuring this is at this knit stitch right here. This is where I'm going to start my measurement. And I go up the column, and I want to make sure that I've got the kind of the purl bump at the top, because when I'm counting seed stitch, it's easier if I'm counting the purl bumps, and then I can double them. And so if I know that I've started at the knit stitch and I'm ending at a purl bump, it's just going to be a little easier to count my rows. Now the final one is cable patterns, and make sure that I've got it there. When you do a cable pattern, and in the master's program we have you put a border around them because it's a little easier to see, make sure that you are measuring the portion of the cable. Now for a cable, I want to measure just the repeat. So this is a repeat, this is a repeat, and this is a repeat, and those are excess stitches. Is that going to make that big of a difference in this particular pattern? No, but in some cable patterns it might, so it's just a good practice to get into. So when I measure, and for cable patterns it's particularly important, notice how this thing pulls in at the sides even after it's been blocked. This is the way I want this to look in the final garment. But I want to make sure that I'm measuring the width at the center portion of this, because this is how this is going to look in my garment for the most part, pulled in at this top, in this way. So that's the best place to measure it. Now, for this particular example, I only want to measure the actual stitch pattern. I don't want to include the borders in it. And so I have indicated that I'm measuring this repeat, this repeat, this repeat, and from here to here. So next week we'll see how we count these rows on these same swatches, measure them, and do the calculation.